Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place where the sun doesn't rise for weeks. Outside, the cold is so deep it feels ancient, like the land is holding its breath under snow and silence. Nothing moves except the wind. And yet in homes built from packed snow and quiet rituals, something begins to stir. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cold or somewhere warm, drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. They used to rise before anyone else, not because they were forced to, but because life in the Arctic didn't wait for permission. Before the fire was lit, before the children stirred, before the first breath warmed the inside of a frozen igloo, it was the women who moved first. The mornings weren't mornings in any familiar sense. During the long polar winter, darkness could last 20 hours a day, or more. They didn't wake by sunlight, they woke by habit, by the shift in breathing of those sleeping beside them, by the weight of the day, already waiting at the edge of the firs. Homes were made of snow blocks, carefully stacked and insulated with animal hides. Inside, the air was still and cold. No windows, no chimneys, only a low lamp and whatever warmth was preserved overnight from the bodies huddled together. They'd slept on raised snow platforms, layered with caribou skins, wrapped in parkas also made from caribou fur, light, warm, flexible. It was never truly comfortable, it was never truly still, but it was home. The first job was lighting the flame. There was no wood in the Arctic, no forests. Instead, they used seal oil stored in shallow stone lamps, with a wick made from moss or Arctic cotton. They'd keep a few coals tucked away, covered in fat, and sometimes those would catch. Other times, they used flint and steel. Lighting the flame was a small act, but everything depended on it. Warmth, food, light. They did it quickly, often silently, not to show stoicism, but because there was simply no time to waste. Once the lamp burned, they moved about the space with quiet efficiency. Every action had a consequence. If the wick was too long, the room filled with smoke. If the fat was too cold, the flame would sputter. Children couldn't be left cold too long. Clothing had to be dried from the day before. Even the faintest draft might threaten frostbite. The men still slept, not out of laziness. Men hunted, and their lives were built around bursts of physical endurance in open space. But before any of that could happen, someone had to get the inside world moving. That was the women's task. They didn't just maintain the home, they animated it. From cold, dark to livable warmth, they orchestrated the transition. There were no stoves, no clocks, no furniture in the modern sense, but the space was organized. The sleeping platform in the back, the food stored by the entry tunnel, tools hung from bones strung across the ceiling. Every object had a place, and every place was maintained by routine. Without routine, things broke, and in this environment, broken things meant real danger. They tended to the children next. Babies were carried in the back of the amati, the large hood of a woman's parka designed for warmth and closeness. Toddlers often woke cold and cranky. They'd be handed small pieces of dried fish or seal blubber, easy energy, eaten without ceremony. No one waited for breakfast together. Meals were scattered, improvised, repeated. If food had been cached outside in the snow, it had to be retrieved. If it was buried under ice, it had to be chopped out, sometimes with tools made from bone. If a man was about to hunt, his gear had to be readied. Boots softened, mittens stitched, belts prepared. They didn't hunt. Not usually. That was true. But their work touched every part of the hunt. They made the clothes. They preserved the meat. They tanned the hides. They maintained the sled. Nothing left the home that hadn't passed through their hands first. In Arctic societies, Inuit, Yupik, Sami, Chukchi, among others, division of labor wasn't about who was more important, it was about who was more essential in different ways. While men moved through space, women shaped the center. Their work wasn't called survival, it was just called life. There was little space for idleness. While waiting for water to melt or meat to thaw, they would sew. Every seam on a parka had to be tight, windproof, and flexible. They sewed with sinew thread, animal tendon dried, twisted, and cut. Needles were made from bone or ivory, passed down from mother to daughter. A single broken stitch could cause frostbite in the field. When the others finally stirred, the room was already alive. The lamp burned steadily, warmth crept into the corners, the first murmurs of speech filled the dome. But the women were already an hour into the day, already thinking 5 steps ahead, about food, clothing, illness, fuel, and silence. This wasn't considered heroism, it was normal. They didn't ask to be honored, they asked to be left to work. And in the most hostile environment on earth, that quiet labor made all the difference. They tended the hearth, but not in the way modern life imagines. There were no logs to throw on the fire, no smoke curling from a chimney. In the Arctic, there were no trees at all. The hearth they kept alive was a shallow stone dish called a kulik, fueled not by wood, but by the fat of animals they or their families had caught, usually seal, sometimes whale. This wasn't just a fireplace, it was the center of life. Keeping it burning was a task passed down from girlhood. It required more than simply lighting a flame. They had to know how to trim the wick so it wouldn't smoke. They had to understand how much oil to feed the flame and when to replenish it. Too much, and it sputtered and filled the room with soot. Too little, and it died, and with it, the only real source of heat, light, and the means to cook. The kulik was a woman's responsibility in almost every Arctic culture. Not because it was easy, but because it required patience and attention to subtle changes. While the men trained to read the snow for prey, women trained to read the fire for stability. It wasn't just for warmth. The lamp was used to melt snow for water, because nothing could be wasted, and snow couldn't be eaten directly without draining the body's heat. They filled small stone pots and placed them near the lamp, watching as the ice slowly turned to drinkable water. The process could take hours. The room would grow damp from steam, then cold again, then warm, always a cycle. And still, they worked around the lamp, weaving, stitching, boiling scraps of meat or marrow. In some communities, they used it to dry sinew or soften hides. The kulik glowed softly, casting low, golden light onto the curved walls of the snow home. The light wasn't strong, but it was enough to thread a needle, enough to see a child's face. Fuel had to be harvested, rendered, and stored. Seal fat was thick and heavy. Rendering it into oil was not a romantic task. It was messy, smelly, and absolutely essential. Women sliced the blubber, stored it in hide containers, and carefully portioned it for the days or weeks to come. On journeys, they often carried small amounts with them, wrapped in skin, to light travel lamps when camp was made. A single lamp could burn for hours if properly tended. 2 or 3 lamps might heat a larger family space. During childbirth, women would cluster more lamps around the birthing area, not just for light and heat, but for comfort. That soft flicker became a kind of symbol: birth, nourishment, survival. The work of the hearth extended beyond flame. It shaped the whole rhythm of the day. Once the lamp was lit, other tasks could begin. Meat could be warmed or thawed. Tools could be softened or repaired. Children could be dried off, dressed, or calmed beside its heat. The home began to hum with small movements, and the cold no longer bit as deeply. Men might praise the light, even rely on it completely, but they didn't tend it, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Their domain lay in the hunt, in weather watching, in journeying over unstable ice. Women stayed with the fire because the fire stayed with them. It was where children were raised, meals were cooked, stories were shared, and healing began. Sometimes, in moments of illness or silence, people would simply watch the lamp, the way it danced along the snow walls, the shadows it cast on fur and bone. It became part of the collective memory. It was said in some places that a flickering lamp could reflect a flickering spirit, that if the flame faltered, something was wrong in the home. And yet it kept going, because they kept it going. In some households, multiple generations of women shared the work of the hearth. Grandmothers taught daughters, who taught granddaughters. The older women remembered when the seal harvest had been lean, when the oil had run low, when they had burned scraps of hide just to stretch the heat for one more hour. Those stories lived in quiet moments, not declarations. They were passed down in instructions, in gestures, in a raised eyebrow, as a young girl trimmed a wick too long. There's a tendency in modern times to romanticize the image of women by the fire. But here, it wasn't about poetry. It was about timing, knowledge, and endurance. Lighting the lamp wasn't a symbol. It was survival. No one gave speeches over the calique. It burned low and steady, like the women who kept it alive, never flashy, never praised in the songs about brave hunters or wild bears. But without that lamp, no one would leave the home, and no one would return to one. They kept it burning through the wind and cold, through hunger and silence. And when the day's work was finally done, and the men returned with stories of snow and blood and seals, the lamp was still there, flickering in the dark, holding the world together. They didn't wear clothing in the way that modern people think of it as fashion, expression, or even comfort. They wore it as a second skin, engineered for survival. And while men might catch the animal, it was women who turned its remains into the garments that made survival possible. Clothing was made entirely by hand, from materials pulled directly from the natural world. There was no metal, no fabric bolts, no buttons. Every piece started with a kill. Caribou was the most common source for inner garments because of its hollow fur, which trapped body heat better than most materials known even today. For outer layers, sealskin was preferred, dense, waterproof and durable. In colder regions, even polar bear or muskox hides were used. But no matter the source, the transformation from carcass to coat fell to the women. Once the animal was butchered, they scraped the hide clean of flesh and fat using tools made from bone, stone, or even the edge of a broken antler. This work required strength and stamina. Hides didn't come off easily, and they certainly didn't clean themselves. The skin would then be stretched over wooden frames and left to dry, often outdoors, in the bitter cold. Frozen hands were part of the process. After drying, the skin was worked by hand until it became supple. In some cultures, this was done by chewing the hide to soften it. In others, it was rubbed with fat and kneaded over hours. The sinews were removed, dried, and separated into thread. Every step was deliberate. Nothing was wasted. With the materials ready, the true craft began. Sewing. Arctic women were expert seamstresses, not as artists, but as engineers. They designed parkas with curved seams to mimic the shape of the body, minimizing wind exposure. They stitched boots with waterproof seams, layering fur inward to retain heat and outward to shed snow. They added fur ruffs to hoods, not for style but because they disrupted wind and kept frost from forming on the face. A man might hunt a seal, but without his wife's sewing skills, he'd freeze long before the next catch. Even within a single outfit, there was incredible nuance. For instance, inner parkas were worn with the fur facing inward, trapping warmth. Outer parkas had the fur facing outward, deflecting snow and wind. Children were dressed in small duplicates of adult gear, each layer cut, sewn, and sometimes decorated by their mothers or aunts. Mittens were lined with rabbit fur, the softest and warmest available. Hoods were made large enough to shelter an infant on the mother's back, tucked inside the parka. Decorative stitching and embellishment existed, but rarely without purpose. Sometimes it marked clan affiliation or family status. Other times it simply helped reinforce a seam. Some groups added ivory toggles or tiny bone beads, not to stand out, but to carry tradition and memory. A woman might wear the same pair of boots for years, but she would also know how to repair them, patching tears with scraps of hide and stitching new soles as needed. There was no wardrobe. Most had only one or two sets of clothing. But these garments were expertly made and maintained, handed down through generations, or bartered for with families who recognized their value. In times of hardship, the skill of a seamstress could be more important than the skill of a hunter. Meat could be traded. Clothing could not be faked. Learning to sew wasn't optional. Girls began young, first by watching, then by practicing with scraps. Mothers guided them, correcting their stitches, showing how to cut hide to match muscle and motion. A crooked seam wasn't just ugly, it let the wind in. Mistakes could cost fingers, or worse. And the labor didn't end once the garment was made. Clothes had to be dried after every outing. Damp fur led to frostbite. Every evening, women turned garments inside out, inspected seams, and sometimes re-stitched areas that had worn thin from use. They placed boots near the seal lamp, softening them with heat and smoke. Gloves were turned inside out to dry, hung on bone pegs or driftwood racks. What's often overlooked is that this skill set wasn't static. They adapted with climate, with season, with terrain. During spring, when the ice began to melt and hunting moved to boats, they might stitch lighter garments or add waterproof layers for splash protection. In midwinter, they reinforced knees and elbows. A woman didn't just make clothes, she calibrated them like tools. Despite their critical role, this labor rarely made it into the oral histories the same way hunting exploits did. But every village knew who the best seamstresses were. Their names circulated. Their stitches were unmistakable. A well-sewn parka could travel miles, passed from hand to hand, admired for its form and function. Clothing was survival, but it was also legacy, and in a world where freezing was a daily risk, it was women's handiwork that kept bodies warm, children safe, and the family mobile through months of snow and silence. They didn't wear fashion, they wore skill. They prepared meals without stoves, pans, or even fire in the way most people would expect. Arctic cuisine wasn't about cooking, it was about making food edible and nourishing with the tools and conditions they had. And while men might bring home the meat, women decided how to portion it, preserve it, and serve it. Most of the diet came from animals: seal, caribou, fish, whale, and occasionally birds or eggs, when the season allowed. There were no vegetables, no grains, no seasonings. Salt was not something they sprinkled. It was something they occasionally found by accident. The concept of a recipe didn't exist. Food was prepared by memory, by necessity, and by feel. Seal meat, for instance, could be eaten raw, frozen, dried, or aged. Each method served a different purpose. In the depth of winter, raw frozen meat was common, not just for convenience, but because it was safer. Cooking over a seal oil lamp was slow and smoky. It wasted fuel, so they sliced meat thin with an ola, a curved woman's knife, and ate it frozen, letting it thaw slightly in the mouth. Organs were prized. Liver, brain, and blubber were often eaten immediately after a kill, because they provided nutrients that would otherwise be lost in cold storage. Blubber in particular was essential, not just for energy, but for staying warm. It had the calories of a feast in every bite. Children were sometimes given small chunks of it like candy, though few outsiders would consider it a treat. Preservation was the key to survival. Women managed it with remarkable foresight. They dried strips of meat by hanging them in the cold air, or over the faint heat of a lamp, rotating them daily to prevent mold. They cached food in snow pits outside the home, using the Earth's natural refrigeration to keep it edible for months. Seal meat might be stored beneath stones, fish buried beneath snow. The location and contents of each cache were memorized, not marked because markers could be buried by snowdrift or stolen by animals. Timing was everything. When a hunting party returned, the food had to be triaged. Some was eaten fresh, some was rendered into oil, some was salted with kelp or frozen for later. Nothing was wasted. Not the bones, not the sinew, not the blood. In fact, blood was often consumed fresh or mixed with fat and snow to make a dense, nourishing paste. There were rare delicacies too. Fermented meat, for instance, was made by wrapping bird or fish in sealskin, burying it underground, and allowing it to break down over weeks or months. The smell was intense, the flavor was even stronger, but it was rich in nutrients and prized in some communities. Preparing it took knowledge, confidence, and good judgment. Bad fermentation could be fatal. They didn't eat on schedules. Meals happened around work, around rest, around weather. Sometimes they snacked constantly throughout the day. Sometimes there were long fasts when hunting was poor. Women adapted accordingly, stretching stores, boiling bones for broth, or portioning dried meat with more fat to increase fullness. Hunger was a constant threat, not dramatic, just present. Tools mattered. The ulu was indispensable, used to cut everything from fish to hide to small pieces of frozen meat. made of slate, later steel. It was curved perfectly for leverage. Women often inherited them from their mothers or grandmothers, the handles worn smooth by generations of use. A good ulu was more than a knife. It was a sign of competence. Children learned young. They were taught which parts to eat, how to chew frozen meat properly to avoid cracking teeth, how to spot signs of spoilage. By the time they could walk, they understood that food wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, managed, protected. Occasionally, when the hunt was good and bellies were full, meals became social events. Neighbors shared excess, and everyone gathered to eat together. These were moments of rare abundance. But even then, the food was served without ceremony. There were no long speeches, no elaborate plating. A good meal was quiet, practical, and eaten quickly before it froze again. In some regions, they used small wooden bowls, often carved by men but managed by women. Food was passed hand to hand, sometimes eaten with the fingers, sometimes with small spoons carved from bone. Infants were fed pre-chewed meat, warmed in the mouth of the mother or grandmother. It wasn't considered odd, it was efficient. What stood out most was the control women had over the food chain inside the home. They decided how much to give, who got what portion, which child needed extra fat that day. They memorized the stores. They noticed when a piece of meat was starting to spoil. They decided what to defrost and what to ration. While men might be celebrated for the hunt, no one forgot who managed the meat once it crossed the threshold. And in a world where one spoiled cache could mean disaster, it was the women, quietly, steadily, and without pause, who fed the Arctic. They worked the skins not just as a chore, but as a full craft that required years of practice, precision, and knowledge. After a successful hunt, the processing of the animal fell primarily to the women, not as an afterthought, but as the next stage of expertise. Where the man's job ended with the kill, the woman's work was only beginning. Each animal provided a wide variety of materials, and every part had to be treated differently. Seal skins were oily and thick, caribou hides more delicate, bird skins fragile but warm. The first task was scraping, using sharp-edged tools, often made of bone or slate. They scraped the flesh and fat from the inside of the skin. The wrong angle could tear the hide. Too little pressure and the fat remained, causing rot. The process wasn't just physically tiring, it required absolute focus. Fresh hides were heavy, wet, and stubborn. Even in winter, this was outdoor work. The hides had to be anchored to the ground with stones or pegged into wooden frames. In some communities, women used their teeth to help strip fine sinew from the hide or to hold tension while scraping. It was not delicate work. Their hands cracked from cold and effort. Their backs bent over the stretched skin for hours. Once scraped, the hides were soaked or left to freeze, depending on the species and purpose. They were then worked again, rubbed with fat, pulled repeatedly over wooden beams or ropes, massaged until they turned soft and pliable. This was called breaking the skin. A stiff hide couldn't be sewn. It couldn't bend with the body. It cracked. So they worked until the leather was soft enough to move like cloth, but still strong enough to withstand the cold. Sinew, the connective tissue along an animal's back and legs, was stripped, dried, and then split into fine threads. It had to be stored properly. If it got damp, it stiffened and became useless. Women prepared spools of sinew as they worked hides, knowing they would need long lengths for winter stitching and repairs. Sinew swelled with moisture, sealing holes without leaking. No modern thread behaved quite the same. Each hide was assigned a future use. Thicker seal skins were often reserved for soles of boots or waterproof layers. Caribou hides became inner parkas or sleeping layers. Fox and rabbit were sometimes used for mittens or trim. Bird skins, small and delicate, could be stitched together to form soft underclothes or baby wraps. Nothing was discarded lightly. These tasks were communal. Women worked together, sometimes singing as they scraped and stretched. The songs kept rhythm, taught younger girls timing and patience, and made long hours less heavy. Elders passed down tips: how to spot a tear before it grew, which part of the seal made the strongest mittens, when to stop working a hide before it thinned too much. Techniques varied by region, by animal, by season. The skins were also used for building materials. Strips of hide reinforced sled lashings or formed cords for tools and weapons. In some areas, large pieces were sewn into tents or used as floor coverings. Again, women did the cutting, sizing and stitching, measuring by hand, sometimes by eye, using familiar body lengths as reference points. Children were introduced to the work early. Girls watched their mothers and grandmothers, first allowed to clean scraps, then given small hides to practice with. They learned by doing, by being corrected, by comparison to older women's work. By adolescence, many girls could fully prepare a hide on their own. It wasn't an expectation, it was part of becoming capable. And these skills weren't just practical, they were respected. A well-tanned hide was noticeable. Traders, travelers, and even hunters could tell the difference. Hides that didn't creak in the cold. Hides that didn't crack when folded. Boots that lasted 2 seasons instead of 1. It reflected on the woman who made them. Her skill, her attention, her value. Every community knew who did the best hide work. Their names were mentioned in quiet admiration. Some women became specialists. If a hunter had a particularly large catch, say a walrus, he might bring the hide to one of the more experienced tanners, knowing the quality of the product would be better. The return on that labor wasn't praise, it was trust. These tasks didn't pause for illness or bad weather. Skins couldn't wait. If they sat too long, they spoiled. If they froze without scraping, they became nearly impossible to soften. Women worked in wind, with stiff fingers, wrapped in layers but often still exposed to the cold. In regions where the sun vanished for months, they still found ways to stretch and scrape by lamplight, adjusting their posture to avoid casting shadows over their own hands. In those months, the quiet sounds of scraping and singing mixed with the oil lamp's steady crackle to create a rhythm that defined the space. This wasn't domestic work in the modern sense. It wasn't secondary or invisible. It was a full system of processing and craftsmanship, without which clothing, tools, shelter, and even food storage wouldn't function. It was its own economy, quiet, demanding, and entirely irreplaceable. In a world where survival was a cycle of preparation and repair, women's work with hide and sinew didn't just clothe the people, it shaped the infrastructure of Arctic life. They sewed not in the leisurely sense, but with a level of precision more often associated with engineers. Sewing was a daily task, but also a high-stakes craft. It determined whether clothing held together through storms, whether boots stayed waterproof during hunts, whether infants stayed warm enough to survive the night. Every stitch had to be strong, every seam intentional. In the Arctic, a poor seam wasn't an inconvenience, it was a potential danger. They used bone needles, finely carved and often inherited. These needles were lightweight and flexible, sometimes sharper than their modern steel equivalents. The holes were small, suited for sinew thread, which swelled when exposed to moisture and sealed seams naturally. That quality made sinew the perfect material. It tightened when wet, closing any gaps left in the fabric. Most sewing was done by women, and in most Arctic cultures, it was expected that a competent adult woman would be able to sew full sets of outerwear, boots, mittens, and sleeping gear. Each item served a specific function, and the design took years to master. The parka wasn't just a coat, it was a carefully constructed garment, with features designed to deflect wind, repel snow, and insulate the body. Hoods were built, with fur ruffs, that created air turbulence to prevent frost from forming on the face. Sleeves tapered to fit closely and minimize heat loss. Bottom hems were often weighted or flared to shed snow. The sewing was done with the hide side facing out or in, depending on the season and purpose. For example, a winter inner parka would have fur turned inward, trapping heat against the body. The outer parka, worn on top, would have fur facing outward to shed snow and ice. This layering system was common and highly effective. It evolved through observation and refinement, passed down through generations. They often sewed in the evenings, around the seal oil lamp, using its soft flickering light to illuminate their work. In that glow, a woman might work quietly for hours, her hands moving in practiced rhythm. Children played nearby or were lulled to sleep by the scratch of sinew through hide. The lamp crackled. Someone might hum. It was not a romantic scene, but it was deeply familiar. Tools were simple and precise. An olu knife was used to cut hides into curved shapes, that fit the contours of the body. The curved blade offered excellent control and reduced hand fatigue during long sessions. Thimbles were sometimes made of hide, sometimes of carved bone. A woman might carry her tools in a small pouch, carefully maintained. If a needle broke, it wasn't easy to replace. The knowledge behind every seam was extensive. Certain types of stitching were reserved for high-stress areas: shoulders, elbows, knees. Double or even triple seams were used where snow might build up or where wetness was a risk. Decorative stitching sometimes reinforced these seams and helped prevent fraying. Waterproof stitching involved overlapping hides, so that water flowed off like shingles on a roof. Even among women, sewing ability could vary. A well-made garment earned quiet respect. Travelers and hunters who received clothing from a skilled sewer often spoke of the difference: how the boots stayed dry longer, how the wind didn't cut through the seams. These weren't luxuries, they were the result of careful hands and years of refinement. There were sewing gatherings, especially during long winters. Women would sit together, each working on her own project, but sharing advice, gossip, and instruction. Girls learned by doing. Their first tasks might involve simple pouches or child-size mittens. Mistakes were common, but correction was patient. By adolescence, most could make a basic pair of boots. By adulthood, they were expected to be able to clothe a family. They repaired constantly. Arctic clothing wore out quickly under hard use. Mittens tore, boots cracked from wetness and freezing, parkas stretched and thinned over time. Women inspected garments daily, checking seams, adding patches, replacing thread. A single missed repair could turn into frostbite. In many Arctic groups, it was considered dishonorable for a man to complain about his clothing. If he returned from a hunt cold or damp, he wasn't expected to fix it himself, but neither was he free to blame the garment. Instead, he was expected to bring it back for quiet repair. No commentary needed. Mutual respect was built into the exchange. The hunter brought home meat. The sewer kept him alive through her skill. Designs varied by region, and women often innovated based on terrain and need. In areas where hunters traveled by kayak, women crafted waterproof outer layers using seal intestines stitched so finely that water couldn't seep through. In inland regions, where snow was drier, women used double layers of caribou hide for greater insulation. Seasonal adjustments were made throughout the year. Spring meant lighter boots and thinner mittens. Winter meant thicker soles, higher collars, reinforced hoods. Even within their own communities, women could identify who had made a particular garment just by its stitch style, the curve of its seams, the finish at the edges. These marks were like signatures, not flashy but clear. Some garments were made for trade, others for marriage. A mother might send her daughter into a new family with a full set of handmade clothing, a demonstration of her preparation and the reputation of her household. In this way, sewing connected to social structures and alliances. They didn't write patterns. They didn't sketch blueprints. The knowledge lived in their bodies and was practiced until it became muscle memory. And when the wind rose or the snow stung, it wasn't the thickness of the hide that kept a family warm. It was the precision of the hands that sewed it. They raised children in homes made of snow and bone, where warmth was not a guarantee, and parenting was an ongoing act of vigilance. In the Arctic, survival wasn't an individual achievement, it was collective. Children weren't raised by a single pair of parents, but by the steady attention of mothers, aunts, older siblings, and grandmothers, each playing their part in a finely tuned social fabric. The environment allowed no margin for error. Infants were carried in the amity, a large pouch built into the back of a woman's parka. It held the baby snug against her skin, shielded from the cold by layers of fur and the mother's body heat. The amity wasn't just a garment, it was a system. The hood was wide and protective, often rimmed with fur to trap warmth. The baby could be shifted around easily, even breastfed without being removed from the pouch. Women adjusted the amity as they moved, working, walking, or even traveling by sled, all while keeping the infant safe and warm. Older children stayed on the raised sleeping platforms during the night, bundled tightly in shared furs. In the bitter cold, they often slept beside parents or siblings for additional warmth. Even toddlers learned to sleep still, to keep furs tucked, to pull their hands into sleeves if they got cold. Nighttime was not peaceful in the modern sense. It was measured in breaths, in quiet checks for frostbite, in the occasional need to relight the lamp or reposition a blanket. The women monitored everything. A child's nose was touched in the morning, not out of affection, but to check for numbness. Cheeks were pressed, fingers inspected. If cold spots were found, they were warmed quickly, gently, before tissue damage could take hold. Mothers were trained to notice the early signs of frostbite, long before the child understood what danger felt like. There were no toys in the modern sense, but there was play. Children mimicked the adult world, learning roles through games. Small tools were carved for them, miniature harpoons, tiny sewing kits, animal bones turned into dolls or tokens. Girls learned to scrape hide and cut meat. Boys learned to aim and stalk, even if just at pretend prey. The games had stakes. They taught necessary skills, reinforced routine, and built physical awareness. Watching was learning. Repetition was safety. Feeding was frequent and fat-heavy. In infancy, babies were given breast milk and small bits of pre-chewed meat. Mothers or grandmothers softened the food in their mouths, making it easier to digest. This wasn't a sentimental act. It was efficient and vital for nutrition. As children grew, they were introduced to raw meat, fish, blubber, and fermented food. There were no separate children's meals. They ate what the adults ate, learning early to manage tough textures and strong tastes. Illness was a constant threat. Colds could turn serious quickly. Diarrhea, in a land with no plumbing or sanitation, was dangerous. The cold compounded everything. Women were responsible for noticing symptoms, administering treatments, and deciding when to seek help from a healer or spiritual intermediary. They used moss as diapers and snow as cleaning cloths. When possible, they used dried herbs and animal oils as balm. But often, healing was preventative. Warmth, nutrition, and close observation were their most reliable tools. Discipline wasn't harsh, but it was strict. In an environment where a child wandering too far from the snow house could die, behavioral boundaries were established early. Warnings were often delivered through story myths about creatures that snatched disobedient children, spirits that punished those who wandered alone, or taboos surrounding play during certain seasons, or in certain places. These weren't just tales, they were mnemonic devices, teaching tools. The burden of care didn't fall solely on mothers. Grandmothers played a central role, both as caretakers and as keepers of wisdom. Older siblings, especially girls, were expected to help. A 12-year-old might already be feeding a toddler, sewing a baby's mittens, or checking for cold patches under a sleeping skin. This shared responsibility meant children were rarely alone, rarely unsupervised. Even with all the danger, childhood was not joyless. There was laughter, there were songs sung while scraping hides, jokes made in the darkness of the sleeping platform. Familiar voices told stories in soft tones, while seal oil flickered on curved snow walls. Children found magic in watching snow fall silently from a roof hole, in carving their first toy from driftwood, in being invited to share dried meat with the adults. These moments were woven into the rhythm of life, not interruptions, but part of the fabric. When the weather was bearable, children went outside. They played near the entrance, watched their fathers prepare sleds, or followed mothers on short walks to retrieve meat from caches. They learned to walk carefully on snow crusts, to read footprints, to recognize the difference between animal trails and dangerous terrain. Each movement was both a lesson and a test. As they age, responsibilities increased. A girl of 8 might be expected to help sew or scrape hides. A boy of 10 might be taught to prepare a snare. But childhood didn't end abruptly. It folded gradually into participation. Children were not romanticized as innocent, nor burdened as miniature adults. They were included, shaped, and absorbed into the daily mechanisms of Arctic life. They grew up in a world where attention to detail was everything, where warmth came not from central heating, but from a well-fitted parka, where food didn't come on a plate, but from a knife. And at the center of all this, the women built systems of care that were flexible, resilient, and entirely in tune with the land. To raise children here wasn't just to love them, it was to equip them, to observe closely, to to prepare them for a world that had no room for forgetfulness, and even less for failure. They didn't pause after giving birth. The rhythm of Arctic life allowed no indulgence for recovery in the way modern cultures might frame it. Birth was recognized as significant, but it wasn't treated as a disruption. It was folded into the continuum of work and necessity, quietly, efficiently, and with the knowledge that the tasks of the household did not stop just because a new life had entered it. Most births took place inside the home, usually on the raised sleeping platform, surrounded by furs and warmed by the seal oil lamp. The air was dry, close, and dim. Birth assistants were usually older women, experienced mothers or grandmothers, who guided the delivery and managed complications. There were no written instructions, no formal ceremonies. Knowledge came from witnessing, repetition, and oral tradition. The laboring woman remained mostly quiet, conserving energy. There were no painkillers, no privacy, no specialized tools, but there was support, hands holding hers, clean moss for absorption, heat from nearby lamps, and furs warmed and ready for the newborn. Silence wasn't stoic posturing, it was necessity. Screams could alarm the children, draw in cold air, or simply be exhausting. Strength was measured in focus. Once the baby was born, the umbilical cord was cut with a sharpened sliver of bone or stone, then tied with sinew or thread from sealskin. The placenta was typically wrapped and buried outside, a ritual some communities associated with returning life to the earth, or ensuring the child's spiritual protection. The baby was examined quickly, wrapped tightly, and placed into the mother's amati to maintain warmth and closeness. Skin-to-skin contact, constant in modern neonatal medicine, was an instinctive norm here. The woman rarely rested for more than a day or two. While she might remain on the platform for a short period, the daily tasks waited: cooking, hide softening, sewing, cleaning, monitoring the fire. Other women in the household might temporarily help, but the expectation was that she would resume her roles quickly, not out of cruelty, but because they all lived close to the edge, and edge living required every hand. Newborns were breastfed immediately, and often. Milk was critical for warmth, hydration, and immunity. The mother's diet, mostly fat and protein, supported lactation, but poor nutrition could lead to difficulties. Women compensated by eating blubber, liver, and marrow-rich meat. If milk supply was weak, grandmothers or co-wives sometimes stepped in to nurse the baby. Wet nursing wasn't unusual, it was communal survival. While birth itself was managed with practiced confidence, it carried real risks: cold-induced infection, hemorrhage, prolonged labor. Without metal tools or antiseptics, there were limits to what could be done. Some complications simply couldn't be resolved. Women who gave birth often and survived into old age were highly respected, not only for their resilience, but for the knowledge they carried. Still, childbirth wasn't hidden. Children sometimes witnessed it. Young girls, especially, were exposed to the process early, learning what it looked like, what came next, and how to react. It was not treated as mystical or shameful, it was simply part of life, a beginning, nested inside a cycle that never paused. There was no naming ceremony in some groups, until the baby had survived several days. Early infant mortality was not uncommon, especially in seasons of poor hunting or harsh temperatures. But when a baby did thrive, they were often named after a deceased relative, a beloved elder, or even a recent dream blending identity with ancestry and memory. Sometimes elders claimed that a baby returned as someone they had lost, and their name reflected that belief. Identity in these communities was circular, not linear. The presence of a newborn shifted the home's rhythms slightly, but never dramatically. Women stitched smaller mittens and baby boots from scraps, lining them with the softest fur they had. They added extra moss to clean up after feedings, tucked dried grasses into the ammonoti to absorb moisture, and watched closely for the signs of chill. Babies didn't cry often, they couldn't afford to. Crying wasted heat, energy, and brought unwanted attention in open camps. Work continued. Women scraped hides while bouncing babies on their backs. They cooked with one hand and held a sleeping infant with the other. If they needed to walk outside, the child came with them, tightly wrapped and shielded from the wind. There were no strollers, no cribs. Movement and motherhood were inseparable. And as soon as possible, the child was folded into the community. Aunts helped hold them. Siblings learned how to check their temperature with the back of a hand. Grandfathers offered carved toys. From the first week of life, babies were exposed to the sounds, smells, and structure of Arctic life. Not because it made them tough, but because it made them aware. There was tenderness, of course, but never indulgence. Affection was shown in firm swaddling, in quiet songs, in carefully prepared food. Babies were not praised, but gently welcomed. They were expected to grow into responsibility, not admiration. There were lullabies, some haunting, some playful, sung while sewing, or scraping skins, or rocking slightly near the lamp. These songs served many purposes, soothing the infant, calming the mother, transmitting oral history. Some were blessings, others warnings. All were soft. And as the baby slept nestled against its mother's back, the lamp flickered on, the hide work resumed, and the cycle of survival carried forward, one more life added to the firelight. They supported the hunters, not by tracking seals or aiming harpoons, but by preparing every item that made the hunt possible. When a man stepped out onto the ice, sled runners beneath him and a spear in hand, he was never alone in his effort. Behind that moment stood hours of invisible labor, clothing that kept him from freezing, rope that held his tools together, food that kept his strength up, and all of it, in one way or another, passed through women's hands. Preparing for a hunt began days in advance. First came the clothing, boots, mittens, inner and outer parkas. All had to be inspected and repaired. Stitching weakened by moisture or time was reinforced with sinew. Soles were scraped clean of snow crust and retreated with oil. Any item overlooked could mean frostbite, immobility, or death. Sled gear needed attention too. Women made and maintained the lashings that bound the sled frame. These were often twisted from sealskin strips, soaked and dried for strength. The straps had to be even, tight, and flexible enough to handle sharp turns and rough terrain. Loose lashings could snap mid-journey, turning a hunt into a rescue mission. They packed the food for the journey: dried fish, meat, chunks of blubber, all designed to be high energy, portable, and cold resistant. These weren't meals to enjoy, they were calories to survive. A well-prepared ration pack was light, compact, and nourishing. Women knew the difference between a piece of meat that would stay chewable when frozen and one that would become too hard to eat. They also made the tools: harpoon lines, float bags, bindings for weapons, all crafted with care and understanding. For instance, the float attached to a harpoon was typically made from a seal's bladder, cleaned and inflated, then sealed and reinforced. If it wasn't watertight, it failed its purpose, and the seal escaped. These floats were often prepared by women, tested by submersion in icy water, and inspected for leaks. Rope was another essential item. Braided from sinew or skin, rope was used for everything from tethering dogs to dragging prey. The quality of this rope mattered. It had to resist freezing, bear weight, and hold knots. Braiding rope wasn't flashy work. It was methodical, often done in the evenings, loop by loop, with practiced hands. Before a hunt, women would help load the sled. They balanced weight, wrapped fragile items in furs, and tied everything down. They reminded their husbands or brothers what to bring, not with nagging, but with clarity. In many cases, they had been through this cycle hundreds of times and knew exactly what was needed. Their input wasn't questioned, it was trusted. When the hunters left, the women returned to work. They didn't rest or wait by the door. Instead, they turned to tasks that would make the return successful: processing earlier kills, sewing new garments, preparing lamps, repairing tools. Their rhythm continued without pause. Sometimes, they watched the weather. Women weren't excluded from environmental knowledge. Many had a practiced eye for reading clouds, for watching animal behavior near the settlement, for interpreting the silence between wind gusts. If something felt wrong, they noted it. If a storm was brewing, they prepared quietly, setting aside food, adding insulation, checking the home's seals. They waited, but never idly. When hunters returned, tired and cold, women handled the transition back into safety. They helped unload the sled. They assessed the catch. They handled the meat, fat, and skins, each with its own process. They cleaned wounds, inspected fingers for frostbite, adjusted garments stiff from ice. Praise was rarely spoken aloud. A successful hunt was celebrated, but not theatrically. There might be a communal meal or a short exchange of words, but more often it was marked by a quiet satisfaction. Meat to eat, hides to cure, tools to remake. Everyone played their role. No one needed a spotlight. If the hunt failed, the consequences rippled through the household. Food stores tightened, spirits dimmed, but the work intensified. Women rebalanced caches, dried every edible scrap, boiled bones for broth, and began repairing tools and garments again for the next attempt. There was no space for blame, only preparation. In many ways, their role in the hunt was logistical, but it was also strategic. They knew who could be trusted to hunt alone. They knew how long rations would last. They understood which clothing pieces would hold up in sub-zero storms and which needed more fur. Their understanding of the hunt wasn't based on the chase, but on the system. Even in marriage arrangements, this role was acknowledged. A capable woman who could outfit a hunter properly brought immense value to her family. Men didn't choose wives for beauty alone. They looked for women who could sew tightly, manage stores well, and prepare for uncertainty. These skills meant survival, not just for the couple, but for the entire group. While men ventured outward, women secured the home base. One moved through space. The other shaped the conditions of return. The success of the hunt didn't belong to the hunter alone. It was the outcome of a network of preparation, trust, and skill. And at its core, women worked quietly, efficiently, and without interruption. Not on the ice, but under the roof, where survival was woven thread by thread. They governed the home, not with titles or declarations, but through the steady maintenance of space, order, and rhythm. In Arctic cultures, leadership wasn't always about speaking the loudest or making decisions in public. Inside the home, be it an igloo of snow blocks or a sod-covered semi-subterranean dwelling, it is the women who maintained balance. Theirs was the authority of routine and regulation, not command. Every part of the home had a purpose. The raised sleeping platform at the back was reserved for warmth. Near the entrance was where equipment, tools, and freshly caught meat were stored. Cooking happened near the central lamp, whose heat was shared by everyone. And while the overall shape of the dwelling was shared by all, its arrangement and rules were managed by the women. They decided where each item went, not arbitrarily, but from experience. A misplaced pair of boots could lead to a wet sleeping area. A knife left on the wrong side of the room could cause an accident. Children weren't allowed to drag furs across dirty floors or lean tools against the lamp. These rules weren't written or spoken with sternness. They were lived. The home functioned because they ensured it did. Cleanliness mattered deeply. Even in a house made of snow, leftover food, scraps of hide, or spilled oil could attract scavengers or cause illness. Women cleaned continuously, scraping, sweeping, sorting. They used snow as a cleaning tool, rubbing surfaces to absorb grease or sweep away debris. A home didn't sparkle, but it was always in order. They also controlled the flow of hospitality. When visitors arrived, whether friends, relatives, or travelers, it was the women who managed where they sat, what was offered, and how long they stayed. Hospitality was serious business. To deny it was shameful, but to offer it poorly was equally frowned upon. A well-run home fed guests without appearing strained. That balance came from the woman of the house. Within these walls, disputes were diffused before they began. Women were often the emotional regulators of the group. If tension brewed between men over a failed hunt, a rivalry, or a disagreement, it was the women who calmed the situation. They did it with timing, by shifting conversation, offering food, involving others, not through confrontation, but through gentle redirection. They raised concerns indirectly, especially with children. If a child was behaving poorly, the mother might speak to a sibling instead, using indirect correction to avoid humiliation. A grandmother might tell a story with a moral that mirrored the child's behavior, allowing the child to absorb the lesson without being singled out. This subtlety was cultural, not evasive. In close quarters, harmony mattered more than open rebuke. Taboos and customs were also enforced through women's awareness. Certain foods couldn't be eaten at specific times. Certain acts were forbidden during pregnancy or menstruation. These weren't superstitions in their context, they were behavioral frameworks that maintained balance within the group, and women knew them best. They didn't have to quote rules, they simply lived by them, and others followed. Decision-making inside the household was rarely made unilaterally. A husband might consult his wife about when to hunt, where to move camp, or how much to share with neighbors. Her input mattered because she knew what resources were left, what repairs were still undone, who had visited recently, and how the group was feeling. Information was power, and she had most of it. In multi-family dwellings, especially in the larger sod homes used in summer, multiple women often shared responsibility. They negotiated sleeping arrangements, assigned chores, and ensured fairness in shared spaces. These negotiations weren't always smooth, but they were rarely ignored. Women who were skilled at managing shared living were valued for their tact and fairness. There were hierarchies among women, of course. Older women, especially those who had raised many children or had exceptional skill in sewing or medicine, held quiet authority. Their words carried weight, even when softly spoken. Younger women listened closely, even when advice came dressed as stories or jokes. Marriage did not erase a woman's ties to her family. In many cases, new brides continued to seek advice from their mothers or aunts. Networks between women stretched across camps and kin groups, built through visits, shared tasks, and exchanges of materials or food. These networks served as informal channels of influence. Who had a good harvest? Who had a reliable husband? Who needed help with sewing? Quiet diplomacy happened between women, and it shaped the flow of community decisions. The idea that men ruled and women submitted simply didn't fit these structures. Yes, men often led hunts or represented the household in external matters, but within the walls of the home, women directed life. They did not need to argue for authority, they embodied it through action, consistency, and unspoken expectation. Rules weren't harsh, they were habitual. A visitor could sense when they entered a well-run home. The lamp burned clean, tools were in place, food was available, children were calm, conversation flowed. These were signs of control, not chaos. In a world where external life was unpredictable, where weather, animals, and terrain constantly changed, the interior world remained steady because women made it so. They were not background figures, they were governors of the domestic domain, maintaining balance one decision, one placement, one quiet correction at a time. They treated illness and injury with a blend of observation, tradition, and careful improvisation. In the Arctic, there were no hospitals, no antiseptics, no written medical texts. What they had instead was experience, memory, and materials shaped by the environment. Healing was part science, part ceremony, and women stood at its center. When someone fell ill, it was usually the women who noticed first. A child's change in breath, a hunter's unnatural silence, a shift in the tone of someone's cough. These details didn't go unnoticed. In homes where warmth was fragile and food was finite, any deviation from normal became important. Prevention was often the first and most powerful form of medicine. Their remedies came from the land. Moss was used as both an absorbent and a wound dressing, soft, naturally antiseptic and plentiful. Blubber and fish oil were applied to cracked skin or frost-nipped extremities to restore flexibility and prevent infection. Boiled bone marrow could be fed to those too weak to chew meat. When inflammation appeared, they might apply cold snow or wrap the area in fur to minimize exposure. For stomach ailments, they turned to specific diets: soft meat, diluted seal oil, or slow-melting snow water. In some groups, bitter-tasting plants gathered during the brief summer were dried and kept for stomach treatment or fevers. These plants were rare and often guarded carefully, stored in small skin pouches, used only when absolutely necessary. They also observed patterns. If multiple people fell ill after eating a certain food, that source was avoided. If a storm brought increased sickness, ventilation might be adjusted. If a child caught frequent colds, she might be moved to a warmer sleeping spot, wrapped in extra furs, or given more fat in her diet. Injuries were common: cuts from tools, burns from lamps, frostbite from sudden weather changes. Women handled these with steady hands. They cleaned wounds with snow or water melted over the lamp. They applied fish skin to deep cuts, letting the natural oils assist in healing and protecting against infection. Skin grafting wasn't part of the vocabulary, but improvisation often came close. Fractures were treated with splints made from driftwood or bone, bound with hide or sinew. Mobility was limited, rest was enforced, and warmth was prioritized. Swelling was monitored. If the injury worsened, they knew when to call on others. Sometimes a more experienced healer, sometimes a spiritual figure. If the physical treatments failed, the line between physical and spiritual was fluid. Some illnesses were believed to have been caused by offending taboos or angering spirits. In such cases, women participated in ritual cleansing or called upon shamans who were occasionally women themselves to restore balance. These rituals weren't showy. They often involved whispered words, offerings of food or quiet songs sung during treatment. Their knowledge was rarely stated aloud. It was shown through action. They knew which seal meat helped boost energy after fever, how to adjust the oil in the lamp to create a warm zone for recovery, how to mix dried berries into fat to help a child regain strength. They didn't list ingredients or explain their logic. They simply did what had worked for generations. They also prepared the sickbed, which meant more than a place to lie down. It had to be the warmest part of the home, closest to the lamp, but not smoky. The furs had to be clean, the coverings adjustable depending on the condition. In crowded dwellings, the sick person needed quiet, which meant children were gently shooed, chores shifted, and stories told in low voices. Women supported each other during childbirth complications, miscarriages, and postpartum weakness. They helped new mothers recover strength with specially prepared foods, massages with warm oil, or simply through rest management, taking over chores, watching the baby, keeping the fire lit. They offered emotional support as well, not in long discussions but in presence. They sat close, tended the lamp, and brought water. Mental distress, though not named in modern terms, was also observed and managed. A woman grieving a lost child might be encouraged to sing, to stitch, to sit with others. Isolation was avoided. The group responded with inclusion rather than explanation. Recovery was not linear, but it was communal. If someone died despite their efforts, women prepared the body. They cleaned it with snow, dressed it in its best clothing, and sometimes placed tools or personal items alongside it. In some regions, they applied charcoal or soot to the face as a protective measure for the journey into the afterlife. Burial was handled by the community, but the preparation came first, and it was careful. All of this illness, injury, healing, mourning, happened in the same space as eating, sewing, and sleeping. There were no separate rooms. The living made space for the healing, and the healers worked without title, without ceremony, and without pause. Their tools were limited, their medicines were few, but their effectiveness came from something more complex. Watching, remembering, adapting. They didn't claim to understand everything, but they knew what helped, and more often than not, that was enough. They practiced beauty not in spite of their environment, but within it, adapting rituals of grooming and personal care to a world made of ice, stone, and animal remains. Arctic life was defined by practicality, but that never meant a complete rejection of aesthetics. Beauty here wasn't idle decoration. It was social signal, identity marker, and personal expression, shaped by survival. Hair was an important feature. In many Arctic communities, women kept their hair long, carefully combed and styled in traditional ways. Combs were carved from bone or ivory, with fine teeth to pull through thick, often wind-tangled hair. Combing was a daily ritual, sometimes done communally, and often while seated near the lamp for warmth and light. Braiding was common, tight, symmetrical, functional. Braids kept hair clean, contained, and symbolic. Specific styles might signal adulthood, marriage, or the mourning of a loved one. Keeping hair clean in a land without soap or running water required clever adaptation. They sometimes used snow as a cleansing agent, rubbing it through the hair to absorb oils and dirt. In some areas, women used melted fat or warm animal oil as a rinse, followed by scraping or rubbing to clean the scalp. It didn't smell like shampoo, but it left the hair soft and tangle-free. Scent wasn't the goal. Manageability and health were. Skincare was equally important. The Arctic cold was relentless, and exposed skin could crack, bleed, or frostbite quickly. Women applied seal or whale oil directly to their faces and hands to create a moisture barrier. This practice wasn't just about preventing dryness, it helped retain heat, repel wind, and keep the skin flexible. The shine that came with it was considered attractive in some communities, a sign of health and preparedness. Tattooing was practiced in several Arctic cultures, especially among Inuit women. These weren't decorative flourishes, they marked transitions, puberty, marriage, motherhood, or spiritual milestones. The tattoos were applied using soot mixed with seal oil, inserted beneath the skin using a bone or needle. Lines were drawn along the chin, cheeks, forehead, arms, and hands. Each pattern had meaning. A woman's face could tell the story of her life, her lineage, her survival. These tattoos weren't hidden or subtle. They were visible in daily life, in gatherings, in the soft lamplight of shared homes. Girls received their first tattoos young, sometimes as early as 12 or 13, an age signaling readiness to contribute fully to adult responsibilities. The process was painful, and there was no anesthesia, but it was also an initiation. Enduring it wasn't just physical, it was cultural. It meant belonging. Adornment went beyond the body. Clothing, too, became a canvas. While parkas and mittens were shaped for survival, many were edged with small decorative touches. Beadwork, dyed threads, animal teeth, or tiny carved pendants. These additions didn't compromise function, they added identity. A woman might line her sleeves with patterned stitching inherited from her mother. A grandmother might pass down a coat with a unique trim, recognized by others as her work. Some women wore amulets, small objects tied into their hair, hung from belts or sewn into the lining of clothes. These could be protective, carved animals, bits of bone, or even pieces of umbilical cords from their children. Others carried small pouches with herbs, feathers, or beads. Their meanings varied: fertility, luck, memory. The Arctic didn't lack beauty, it shaped it through meaning. Paint and pigment also played a role. In some regions, women used soot mixed with oil to darken their eyes, or paint thin lines along the temples. These weren't for allure in a romantic sense. They might serve spiritual or social functions, or simply mirror the designs of their ancestors. In the flickering light of a seal lamp, the pigments created shadows on the face that seemed to move with every breath. Seasonal shifts affected beauty practices. During the long dark winters, clothing became heavier, skin more protected, and grooming adapted accordingly. But when the sun returned and travel increased, women were more likely to ceremonies. These were moments for more elaborate braids, for displaying garments with intricate seams or beadwork, for singing and storytelling. Beauty became social again. Girls watched and learned. They were taught to oil their skin, to keep their nails clean, to recognize the signs of chapped lips or early frostbite. They learned how to maintain their garments, repair torn stitching, and match items with care. These weren't called lessons, they were simply part of life. A well-kept appearance didn't signal luxury, it signaled readiness. Beauty was also resilience. In the face of cold that could split skin open, and snow that could erase your reflection, maintaining care for the body and the self was a quiet act of defiance. It said, I am here, I am intact, I still belong. And even in a land of ice, wind, and bare essentials, they found ways to shape and show identity, not with extravagance but with memory, tradition, and the enduring patterns of the hands that came before them. They watched over the spirit world as closely as they watched over their children. In Arctic cultures, physical survival was only part of life. The unseen world of dreams, omens, and invisible forces was just as present, and within that domain, women played a vital role, often as the first to sense imbalance, danger, or the need for spiritual repair. It wasn't always formal. Most women weren't shamans or spirit talkers, but all women were raised to observe the quiet signs that something wasn't right. A child waking up screaming from the same dream 2 nights in a row. A hunter returning with meat that spoiled too quickly. A sudden silence in the dogs. These were not dismissed as coincidences. They were taken seriously. and it was often the women who noticed them first. Children were especially vulnerable to the spirit world. In many communities, it was believed that young children existed closer to the boundary between life and the unseen. Their dreams could be doorways, their cries, signals. Mothers and grandmothers listened closely. A nightmare might prompt a cleansing ritual, burning moss, adjusting sleeping positions, or whispering protective words. Sometimes an object, a pendant, a scrap of cloth, a piece of driftwood was placed beside the child to guard their sleep. Women told stories that served as more than entertainment. These stories carried encoded warnings and teachings, tales of shape-shifting animals, vengeful spirits, or creatures that punished those who broke taboos, weren't just folklore. They were memory tools. They taught children which places to avoid, what not to do during certain seasons, how to behave during sickness or death. And while the entire community passed these stories along, women were the primary weavers of them at home. In times of illness or misfortune, if physical remedies didn't work, it was often the women who made the first move towards spiritual solutions. They might call for a shaman, called an angakuk, among Inuit groups. But more often, they began smaller interventions themselves, moving objects within the home, changing sleeping arrangements, preparing certain foods, thought to rebalance the household, repeating ancestral chants during the night. Some women were known for having spiritual sensitivity. They weren't always full-time shamans, but they had reputations for intuition, dream interpretation, or healing hands. Neighbors might visit them quietly, seeking advice after a string of bad hunts or a troubling dream. These consultations weren't grand events. They happened in the corners of homes, over seal oil lamps, in the pauses between daily chores. Protective customs were embedded in daily life. When a woman left the home with a baby in the amati, she might place a small charm inside the pouch to ward off wandering spirits. When meat from a dangerous animal like a polar bear was brought home, women followed specific steps for processing, not just for hygiene, but for respect. A bear, in many Arctic traditions, had a soul, a memory, and expectations. Disrespecting it could bring misfortune. Death was a serious spiritual moment. Women helped prepare the body, not just physically, but spiritually. They cleaned the deceased, dressed them, sometimes with specific markings or objects, and arranged them for burial in accordance with tradition. In some regions, they burned or removed items from the home afterward to cleanse the space. The spiritual residue of death was real and had to be managed, and it was usually the women who knew how. Men might also perform rituals, especially shamans, but the baseline emotional and spiritual regulation came from women's consistency. They sang lullabies with protective lines. They remembered which family members had died in which seasons, and adjusted behavior accordingly. They avoided speaking certain names at the wrong times. This wasn't superstition, it was structure. Even the seal oil lamp was part of the spiritual world. If the flame flickered unusually, if smoke filled the home for no reason, it could be read as a sign. Women learned to interpret these details from their elders. A bad omen didn't trigger panic, but it did lead to action. A change in behavior, a shift in routine, a pause in planned travel. Some women did become full shamans. These were rare and often marked by early signs, persistent visions, unexplained illnesses, dreams that mirrored real events. If chosen, they underwent training, which could be harsh. Isolation, fasting, instruction from an older shaman. Once trained, they acted as intermediaries, between the people and the spirit world, between life and illness, between what could be seen and what could only be felt. These women weren't always admired openly. Their power came with discomfort. People respected them, sometimes feared them, and didn't always include them in daily routines. But when serious illness struck, or when something inexplicable haunted a home, they were sought out quietly, urgently. In most households, though, it was the everyday woman who kept the spiritual threads tied tight. Through stories, gestures, whispered songs, careful glances at the sky or the lamp, they managed the moods and flows of energy. They weren't dramatic, they were attuned. In the dark months, when the sun didn't rise and dreams grew vivid, this awareness deepened. Women sat near the flame, their hands busy with sewing, but their ears listening to breath, to words muttered in sleep, to the rhythm of the wind outside. The world didn't end at the walls of the home, and they made sure it stayed in balance, seen and unseen alike. They approached marriage not as a romantic destination, but as a practical alliance shaped by environment, kinship, and continuity. In the Arctic, partnerships weren't just about two people. They were about families, resources, and the long game of survival. Women married young, often in their teens, and their role within the union was clearly defined, but not powerless. Marriages reflected cultural expectations, not sentimentality. The idea of love existed, but it wasn't the foundation. In many Arctic societies, marriages were arranged by parents or elders, based on considerations like skill, reliability, kinship ties, and geography. A woman's sewing ability could weigh as heavily in the decision as a man's hunting success. A well-made parka kept a family alive. A bad one risked the whole household. Women moved into the husband's household, sometimes across great distances. These relocations were rarely dramatic. They were negotiated, understood, accepted. In many cases, the woman knew the family already. But even when she didn't, she adapted quickly. Integration wasn't optional. She brought her skills, her tools, and sometimes her younger siblings or children from a previous arrangement. Marriage in these cultures was flexible and often layered with other practical arrangements. Polygamy existed, especially in communities where the gender ratio tilted or where sharing resources made better sense. Co-wives worked together, raised children together, sewed side by side. Tension was not absent, but harmony was expected. Women learned to navigate these dynamics, quietly, diplomatically. Elders might step in if competition disrupted the home, but often it was the women themselves who managed the balance. Marriages could be initiated through trade or hospitality. A visiting family might leave a daughter behind as part of a negotiated alliance. A man might offer goods or labor in exchange for permission to marry. These exchanges weren't viewed as transactions in a demeaning sense. They were cultural norms, rooted in reciprocity. Both families benefited. Both families observed. Consent was complicated by context. While some women had little say in initial arrangements, many cultures still acknowledged that forcing a woman into a union against her will could bring dishonor or even spiritual misfortune. In practice, this meant some women had subtle ways of refusing, dragging out preparations, appearing clumsy in duties, or signaling disinterest to elders. In other cases, they accepted the match with clear expectations that she would contribute, adapt, and eventually find space for herself within the household. Once married, the woman's responsibilities expanded. She was expected to sew for the family, raise children, manage food supplies, maintain the hearth, and uphold social protocols. In some groups, a new bride remained quiet for weeks, listening more than speaking, learning the rhythms of her new home before asserting herself. This wasn't submission, it was strategy. Observation allowed her to learn unspoken hierarchies, household tensions, and alliances. In time, her influence grew. The more competent she became, the more she was relied upon. A woman who could efficiently prepare hides, manage guests, discipline children, and speak well during communal gatherings became indispensable. Her value extended beyond her marriage into the network of the entire settlement. Not all marriages were permanent. Divorce, while not celebrated, was possible. A woman might return to her parents' home. A man might remarry if a union failed to produce children. These changes were handled with practicality. There were no courts or ceremonies, just a shift in residence, an adjustment in daily rhythm. The social implications varied by group, but personal survival always came first. Romantic affection could develop, but it wasn't public. There were no love letters or grand gestures. Instead, affection showed in small ways, sharing the warmest sleeping spot, saving a choice piece of meat, stitching extra reinforcement into a partner's mittens. In stories and songs, love existed, but it often came with consequences. Jealous spirits, disrupted harmony, danger from favoritism. Jealousy wasn't absent, but it was rarely voiced openly. In polygynous households, women learned to navigate shared attention. Some found companionship with co-wives, others maintained polite distance. The priority remained the smooth running of the household. Children's needs, food management, and social duties outweighed personal emotion. Children were central to marriage. Fertility was both blessing and responsibility. A woman who bore many children was respected, not only for her motherhood, but for her stamina and value to the group. Infertility, while rarely blamed outright, sometimes led to second marriages or additional wives. Children also cemented a woman's place in her husband's family, especially sons, who could eventually provide hunting support. Mothers-in-law held real power. A woman's standing in her new home was often influenced by her relationship with her husband's mother. Conflict was not uncommon, but neither was mentorship. Older women often taught younger brides the local customs, sewing patterns, food taboos, and social rhythms. Over time, daughters-in-law became mothers-in-law, and the cycle continued. Even within these structured systems, exceptions existed. Some women took lovers. Some unions began with personal affection rather than arrangement. Some marriages became lifelong partnerships of mutual trust and quiet loyalty. But the foundation was always pragmatic. It had to be. Love alone couldn't skin a seal or repair a sled. Marriage was not a status symbol or a personal ideal. It was a framework of labor sharing, child rearing, and resource management. And within that framework, women carved space for themselves, not as passive recipients of tradition, but as active participants shaping the rhythm of the household and the future of the group. They sang when they couldn't speak freely. In Arctic communities, where homes were small, privacy was limited, and social balance mattered, women used song as a tool, sometimes for comfort, sometimes for memory, and sometimes for expression. They couldn't voice out loud. These weren't performances, they are part of life, stitched into the hours of sewing, the rhythm of scraping hides, the hush of evenings by the lamp. Songs varied by region, but they often carried more than melody. A lullaby wasn't just for sleep. It might contain advice, veiled criticism, or a reminder of an older story. Work songs kept tempo during long, repetitive tasks. But within these songs were phrases with double meanings, metaphors drawn from nature or folklore. Those listening carefully could hear what wasn't being said outright. Story songs were also used to preserve events. A difficult hunt, a lost child, a sickness that swept through the camp. These could all become verses. Women remembered and repeated these songs for years, passing them along like oral records. In a culture without writing, this was how memory survived. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was humming while cutting meat, or chanting softly while rocking a baby. Improvised singing was common. A woman might start a line while sewing, and another might answer it while cooking. The exchange could go back and forth like conversation, layered with meaning. Children listened. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they went quiet, sensing something deeper. Songs created a space where honesty could exist without breaking social rules. Women composed their own verses, often adding to traditional melodies with new lines based on recent events. A wife frustrated with her husband might sing a verse about a slow-moving caribou. A mother angry with a careless child might sing of a young fox who lost its den. These songs allowed emotion without direct confrontation. They preserved dignity while still releasing tension. Some songs were shared only among women. These were often private, about marriage, birth, aging, or grief. A daughter might learn them from her mother, not in a formal lesson, but by overhearing them again and again in daily life. The tunes were simple, the lines repetitive, but the effect was lasting. A woman might sing the same song her grandmother once did, changing only a word or two to make it hers. Some songs were about loss. After death, a woman might sing alone while preparing the body or sitting quietly in the corner of the home. These mourning songs weren't always words, sometimes just sounds, sustained and low, carrying the weight of absence. Others would join in, not to overpower the grief, but to share it. The song became a thread holding the community together during sorrow. In gatherings or celebrations, women might sing together, creating call and response patterns that echoed through the snow homes or summer tents. These communal songs weren't solemn, they were lively, filled with teasing, humor, or gentle boasts. One verse might praise someone's hunting success. Another might poke fun at their clumsy dancing. Laughter was part of it. Harmony, too. When women traveled to marry into a new group, to visit distant family, or to migrate for the season, they brought their songs with them. These became bridges between camps and generations. A melody heard in one place might reappear months later in another, slightly changed but still familiar. Songs carried distance the way speech could not. Not all songs were public. Some were whispered only to babies, known only to the one who sang them. A lullaby, created by a mother, might never be repeated outside that moment. It was a gift, a connection between the singer and the sleeper. Even as the child grew, those first songs shaped how they heard language, rhythm, and care. In times of conflict, music offered another path. Instead of confrontation, a woman might sing a line that called attention to an injustice, a forgotten obligation, a broken agreement. The message was heard, but not argued with. It didn't provoke a fight. It lingered, quietly pressing on the conscience of those it was meant for. In the Arctic, where words could be dangerous if spoken too directly, and silence often filled the long, dark nights, songs offered a space in between. A voice raised in melody could say what the speaker never would. And in that quiet power, women carved out their own language, just audible enough to last. This practice extended beyond homes. In some traditions, women participated in song duels, structured exchanges of verse meant to resolve disputes, entertain the group, or display wit. These were part theater, part contest. Participants traded rhymed or rhythmic lines, poking at each other's flaws or bragging about their own skill. These duels weren't always friendly, but they were contained, an outlet for tension that left dignity intact. The structure of these songs, simple, repetitive, melodic, allowed them to stick in memory. A girl could learn dozens by adolescence. A grandmother might know hundreds. The songs blended daily routine, with oral history, laughter with grief, criticism with love. Food preservation became a constant concern. Supplies cached during the lighter seasons had to be checked, rotated, rationed. Frozen meat needed to be brought in, thawed near the lamp, cut, and portioned. Dried fish or blubber had to be softened just enough to chew. Women handled all of it, without waste, without shortcuts. A single spoiled cat. The dark season reshaped everything. Men often reduced their travel, or limited their hunts to nearby routes. Dangerous weather and shifting ice made long expeditions riskier. That meant more time spent indoors, more mouths to feed around the clock, more noise, more crowding, more pressure. And while the men rested or worked on tools, the women's workload did not shrink. It adapted. They endured the long, dark winters without slowing down. In much of the Arctic, winter didn't last a few months. It dominated most of the year. For weeks or even months, the sun never rose. Days blended into night, and the land outside disappeared beneath snow and silence. Yet inside their homes, women carried on with their work, adjusting not just to the cold, but to the rhythm of darkness itself. Storytelling increased during these months. Without outdoor chores or travel to break up the day, people gathered more often in the evenings. Women told stories while they worked, sometimes alone, sometimes in turns. The stories served many purposes. They entertained children, taught lessons, preserved memories, and passed the hours. Some were funny, others eerie, especially the ones involving spirits who roamed in the dark. Sewing became central during the dark season. Women repaired and reinforced clothing, stitched new garments for growing children, and made extras in case of sudden hunts or emergencies. The limited light from the seal oil lamp was enough for them, just barely. They leaned close, eyes adjusted, hands moving by feel as much as sight. Shadows played across the walls, and the air smelled of fat and fur. Time blurred. There were no clocks. Women kept track through habit, task order, and body memory. When to eat, when to clean, when to sew. These rhythms anchored life when the sun no longer did. Even young children learned to move within these patterns, sensing when it was time to be quiet, when chores were expected, when stories would come. Mental strain affected everyone, but women bore the responsibility of managing it. They noticed when someone became withdrawn, irritable, or restless. A child refusing food, a husband who slept too long, an elder who stared at the wall. Women intervened softly, changing routines, shifting work roles, telling brighter stories, offering a special piece of dried meat. They didn't name the mood, they managed it. With increased indoor time came the need for constant cleaning and reorganization. The home filled with condensation from breathing, cooking, and melting snow. Furs became damp. Clothing had to be dried daily. Women rotated sleeping skins, aired out garments, and scraped frost from tools and walls. Small details mattered. Dampness led to illness. Clutter led to accidents. They stayed ahead of both. Craftwork also expanded in the darkness. Women made toys, combs, pouches, charms, and ornaments. These weren't just distractions. They were gifts, tools, and trade goods. A well-made item could be exchanged later, strengthening social ties. Girls practiced their sewing, learning to shape mittens or boots from scraps. Boys carved small animals, or practiced knots. Women supervised and participated, ensuring that skill passed alongside time. Music and games helped break the monotony. Women led rhythm games with children, created simple competitions, and sang old songs. Laughter was encouraged. It released tension, even in cramped quarters. And when silence returned, it was calmer, not heavy. These moments didn't erase the cold or the dark, but they softened it. Though confined indoors, the outside world was not ignored. Women kept an eye on the entrance tunnel, brushed away snow, and listened to the wind. A sudden change in temperature or snow pressure might require reinforcing the roof or checking for leaks. They noticed when dogs grew restless, when snow hardened differently beneath their boots. The environment still spoke, it just required closer listening. Occasionally, conflicts flared. Too many people in too small a space for too long. It was inevitable. Women addressed these conflicts indirectly. A joke to cut tension, a quiet word, a shift in sleeping positions. In rare cases, a stronger intervention. They knew how to protect the emotional balance of the group, as carefully as they protected the food stores. They weren't celebrated for this endurance. It wasn't called heroism. It was expected, practiced, inherited. And when the sun finally returned, first as a thin line on the horizon, then a pale glow above the snow, it was the women who had kept everything moving, quietly, without missing a beat. Their own needs were set aside. If sleep was interrupted by a crying child or a drifting lamp flame, they rose without complaint. If someone needed extra food or attention, they adjusted their portion or postponed their rest. They didn't speak of sacrifice. It was simply part of the season. They handled death, not as a disruption, but as part of the cycle they knew intimately. In the Arctic, where the environment offered no leniency, death came with frequency and finality, whether through illness, injury, cold, or accident. It arrived quickly, and it was the women who responded first. They were the ones who prepared, preserved, and remembered. Grief was not abstract. It was physical, detailed, and always close at hand. But burial was never easy. The ground was frozen most of the year, harder than stone, impossible to dig without tools, and even then, often impractical. In some regions, especially during winter, burial in the traditional sense didn't happen. Instead, bodies were wrapped in hides and laid above ground, weighted with stones to protect them from scavengers. In others, raised platforms made of wood or stone were used. These arrangements required planning. Women organized the materials, cleaned the body, and made the choices that no one else wanted to speak aloud. The body was washed with snow. Hands and face were cleaned. If available, fresh furs were used to wrap the deceased, often sewn closed by the same hands that had sewn their clothing in life. Personal items were sometimes placed with them. Tools, bits of food, charms, amulets. These weren't grave goods in the ceremonial sense, but rather extensions of the person, a final provision. Women prepared the space where the dead would lie. They flattened snow, arranged stones, gathered branches or bones. They worked with the same precision they applied to sewing or cooking. Each movement measured, each task understood. Death wasn't handled with loud mourning, it was managed with competence. Spiritual belief shaped their approach. In many communities, death did not end a person's presence. The soul lingered, observed, remembered. Certain taboos were followed to keep the spirit at peace. Women often led this process, avoiding the name of the dead for a time, removing their belongings from the home. adjusting sleeping arrangements to honor the shift in energy. It was believed that improper treatment of the body, or its memory, could bring misfortune or unrest. Women also manage grief in the living. They recognized the signs: silence, withdrawal, unusual anger or fatigue. They adjusted workloads, shared tasks, offered small comforts. They told stories. Sometimes the stories weren't even about the dead, they were about old hunts, funny mistakes, ancestors long gone. But in telling them, they made space for grief to move. Sometimes, the dead were named again, but in a new form. Newborns were occasionally given the names of the recently deceased, believed to carry on their presence. A grandmother might be reborn in a granddaughter, a hunter in a baby boy. These choices weren't random, they were made by elders, sometimes based on dreams or signs, and often confirmed by women who noticed behavior or traits that echoed the lost one. Children were not shielded from death. They witnessed it, helped with preparations, listened to the adults' quiet explanations. A child might be asked to bring moss for cleaning, to carry a fur covering, to walk beside the procession. This wasn't seen as cruel, it was part of their education, about life, about responsibility, about continuity. Songs marked the passing, not elaborate dirges, but soft, repetitive chants. A woman might hum while preparing the burial wrappings. A grandmother might sing as the snow was brushed from the path. These songs did not promise peace, they remembered the person, they named what had been lost, but also what remained. Season-shaped grief, too. A death in the winter had different complications than one in the summer. In warmer months, burial could be deeper. Earth could be dug. Memorial gatherings could be held outside. In the dark season, loss was heavier, harder to process without sunlight or movement. Women compensated by increasing routine, keeping children busy, regulating the emotional temperature of the home, not through speeches, but through structure. Sometimes, grief needed space. A woman who had lost a child might withdraw. Others respected this without isolation. They checked on her, left food nearby, offered her easier tasks. No demands were made, but she was not forgotten. Grief was honored, not avoided. They also carried the memory forward. In everyday conversation, a woman might recall the strength of a sister lost in childbirth, the laughter of a cousin who died on the ice. These weren't solemn moments, they were part of life's texture. The dead were folded into the living, not with shrines but with memory that remained useful, specific, and alive. There were no professional mourners, no official priests, but women held the emotional and spiritual memory of the group. They remembered dates of previous deaths, connections between families, names that weren't spoken anymore. They kept track of who was still grieving, even when no one else did. Death did not make them pause, it deepened their work. After loss, homes needed more cleaning, more organizing, more attention to balance. Children needed more watching. Lamps needed more tending. The world didn't stop for grief, so women kept going, with quiet endurance, with detail, and with the understanding that life and death sat close together in the snow. They didn't panic, they didn't wail, they watched the weather, calculated the days, and marked the time. If the group had a shaman, they might ask for guidance, a sign, a dream, an omen. But even without confirmation, the signs of a lost hunter were clear. The days passed. Supplies ran low, silence deepened, and the air inside the home changed. They adapted when the men didn't return. A hunting trip gone longer than expected wasn't unusual, but sometimes, longer became never. A sled team vanished into a white horizon. A boat failed to come back before the ice sealed the water. A man fell through thinning ice, or was taken by a bear. In those moments there was no ceremony, just a shift, and women knew exactly what to do. The emotional burden was often internalized. Grief had no place to sit for long. In the middle of winter, women didn't suppress feeling. They set it alongside their sewing, their cooking, their hide scraping. If tears came, they came while working. If sorrow needed a voice, it came through song, through story, through quiet hums in the evening when the lamp flickered and the home fell still. In many Arctic cultures, the idea of ownership was communal. When a man disappeared, his brothers or male kin might step in to support the household. But even when that help came, it was the women who orchestrated the adjustment. They distributed labor differently. They assigned older boys to more serious tasks. They asked girls to help with adult work earlier than expected. The system flexed, but it did not break. The work increased. A man missing meant not only emotional loss, but a missing set of hands. A father, a hunter, a sled driver, a meat provider. Women didn't fill the hunting role directly in most cases, but they stepped into every other one. They rationed food. They reassessed caches. They explained the absence to children with clarity, not fantasy. Children asked questions. Will he come back? Why didn't he take me? The answers were rarely softened. He might be gone. The ice was bad. The bear was too strong. These weren't harsh statements. They were clarity shaped by love. Protecting children from reality didn't help them survive it. So the truth was shared, gently in pieces they could carry. Some waited longer than others. A wife might continue preparing her husband's favorite meal, setting aside his mittens for repair, keeping his name in daily conversation. But over time, even the waiting changed shape. Not into forgetting, but into functioning. Women sometimes remarried, but not out of romance. It was survival. Another hunter might join the household, not just as a husband, but as a provider. In some groups, levirate marriage existed, a widow marrying her husband's brother. This wasn't seen as scandalous or awkward. It kept resources, children, and kinship networks intact. And in nearly every case, the woman had a say. Occasionally, women took over sled driving or joined short hunts near camp. These weren't long-term shifts in gender role, but temporary adaptations. The group needed meat. She was available. Her knowledge of terrain, weather, and animal behavior, learned through years of observation, was enough. Some succeeded. Others returned to camp empty-handed, and no one blamed them. Trying was the duty. The result was secondary. Community support helped, but only to a point. Women leaned on one another. Tasks were shared. Meals stretched. Children played together so that their mothers could work in relative quiet. No one woman carried it alone, but each still carried the weight differently. They also remembered, years after a man disappeared, a woman might still tell his stories, how he hunted, the jokes he made, the way he packed his gear. These memories weren't indulgent. They were information. They taught children about their father, preserved skills through example, and helped younger hunters understand how loss could happen and how to move forward afterward. What's striking is how little women allowed grief to slow them. Not because they were emotionally numb, but because the home still needed to function. Children still needed food. Lamps still needed tending. Furs still needed drying. Grief was a layer, not a halt. The absence lingered in objects, a spear untouched, boots that no longer needed repair, a carved charm that hadn't left the house in months. Women didn't display these things. They kept them in quiet corners, sometimes repurposing them for another son, a nephew, or a visitor. Memory stayed functional. Rituals for the missing were sparse. A small offering might be made, a piece of meat set outside, a few whispered words into the wind. In some regions, songs were sung on the day the man was presumed lost, not a funeral song, but one of transition, a shift in roles, a closing of expectation. And when spring came, when the snow softened and the seal pups returned, they were ready, not fully healed, perhaps not even fully hopeful, but steady, alive. Still holding the home together in a world that offered no guarantees. They celebrated with the same hands that scraped hides and stirred seal fat. Joy in the Arctic wasn't constant, but it was deeply felt when it came. Feasts, dances, and games marked good hunts, changing seasons, births, and reunions. And behind every moment of celebration was a woman, preparing the meat, organizing the space, and keeping the flow of the event intact, without ever stepping into the spotlight. In the harshest moments, they relied on habit. The same stitching they had done every day, the same stories they had told, the same rhythms of morning and night. Habit kept the world turning until something new could grow in place of what was lost. Feasts were rare, not because people didn't want to gather, but because abundance was fleeting. When food was plentiful, after a successful whale catch, a sudden surge of fish, or the return of migratory birds, communities came together. The men might credit the hunt, but it was the women who turned raw meat into shareable meals, who portioned blubber and cleaned intestines, who laid out snow-cleared floors for seating and checked that everyone had a place. The cooking itself wasn't elaborate. There were no spices, no sauces, but it was precise. Some dishes were aged or fermented. Others were carefully thawed near lamps or snow-softened before serving. Presentation meant order, not decoration. Sinew-bound bowls, carved ladles, slabs of clean hide, each item placed with intention. Food preparation for feasts was expansive and physical. Women carved meat into manageable pieces, selected the best parts to be served first, and distributed them according to age, status, and contribution. Elders were honored, children served generously, and guests from other camps given the choicest bites. These customs weren't just polite, they reinforced bonds. A poorly served meal could offend, a generous one could forge alliances. Dancing followed, usually with a small space cleared in the center of the home or outdoors in summer. Movements were restrained, shaped by the limitations of clothing and the cold, but expressive. Women participated alongside men, sometimes leading chain dances, sometimes performing partner steps to echo the themes of the songs. Laughter was constant. Jokes were passed between bites of meat. Children were included, mimicking adult movements, adding their own verses, trying to sneak extra food. Women kept them close, guiding behavior without scolding, enjoying the rare chance to relax structure while still maintaining harmony. Once the food was eaten, the festivities began. Music emerged from simple instruments, hand drums, bone clappers, voices raised in rhythm, and it was often women who led the songs. They called out refrains, shared old melodies, introduced teasing verses aimed at relatives or visiting families. These songs wove memory and fun together, sometimes recounting hunting mishaps or love triangles, sometimes simply describing animals in motion or children's first steps. Games played during these events tested strength, balance, or cleverness. Some were physical, pulling contests, leg lifts, breath-holding challenges. Others were mental riddle games, memory sequences, mock arguments resolved through song. Women often played, competed, and judged. They knew the rules, the players, and the stakes, which were rarely material and often reputational. One game involved mimicking. Women and men would impersonate each other's voices, gestures, or habits, often with exaggerated flair. Laughter rolled through the home as a wife mocked her husband's snoring, or a girl imitated her grandmother's stern face. These games didn't tear down, they reaffirmed closeness. To be joked about was to be known. Preparation for these events wasn't always spontaneous. Women planned ahead, setting aside pieces of meat, preserving certain skins for special clothing, weaving beads or carving adornments. Celebrations were not just about the moment, they were built in advance, in secret pockets of time carved between endless daily work. They also managed the emotional energy of the gathering. If tensions rose between families or old arguments stirred, women smoothed over the silence with distraction, food, or song. They paid attention to who laughed too loudly or who grew quiet too suddenly. In many cases, they turned a gathering from fragile to joyful, without anyone even realizing it was necessary. Feasts sometimes aligned with seasonal change. First light after the long dark, first snowfall of winter, first seal pup caught in spring. In these moments, the celebrations held deeper meaning. Women sang older songs, sometimes not heard for a year or more. These connected the present to the past, their children to their ancestors, and the community to the wider rhythms of nature. The home itself transformed during feasts. Sleeping areas were rolled up, tools pushed aside, lamps adjusted for more light. Women oversaw the reshaping of space and the return to order once the celebration ended. Cleanup was not an afterthought. It was the final stage of the ritual. Leftovers preserved, furs re-dried, ice swept, everything back in its place before the next freeze. And when the gathering ended and the snow settled back into silence, it was the women who restored the stillness, who packed the tools away, wiped the bowls clean, quieted the children, and turned once again to the daily rhythm. The celebration faded, but the memory stayed, in song, in smell, in story. And it was the women who carried all three. Decorations were minimal, but meaningful. A bit of red ochre, a well-carved spoon, a parka trimmed with a rare fur. These were noticed, complimented quietly. Remembered. A woman might wear her finest belt, or bring out a pouch inherited from her grandmother. These weren't displays of wealth, they were signals of continuity. They starved differently. When food was scarce, and scarcity was always just a season or storm away, women adjusted first, rationed more strictly, and gave up more of their share without comment. Hunger in the Arctic wasn't a rare disaster, it was a recurring fact of life, and women navigated it with a quiet, steady logic built from habit, not heroism. The Arctic provided no fallbacks, no stored grain, no root cellars full of vegetables, no fishing boats stocked for months at sea. A single failed seal hunt could tip a family into rationing. A stretch of warm weather might thin the ice, driving game away. A snapped sled runner might delay travel to cached food. And when these things happened, it was the women who recalculated the household balance first. Men were prioritized during hunts. Not out of favoritism, but necessity. They needed energy to reach distant seal holes, to carry loads, to pull sleds. Women understood this. They adjusted accordingly. Their own meals became smaller, less frequent, sometimes just a strip of dried fish or a piece of blubber melted slowly in the mouth. Hunger crept in, but they didn't speak of it. They checked what was left, not just meat, but fat, dried skins, marrow bones, fish heads. Every part had a caloric role. Every scrap mattered. Women assessed how many days it could stretch, who needed the most, and how to disguise the thinning portions without alarming the children. Infants and elders were also shielded. Women diluted their own share, softened tougher pieces for children, offered marrow to the old. A mother might chew leather to soften it, hoping it could fill her child's belly for a while. In extreme conditions, even boiled boots, made from animal hide, became food. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Cooking habits changed. Soups became thinner. More snow was added to stretch volume. Meat was boiled twice. Scraps from bone were scraped with precision, then boiled again to extract every trace of fat. Even grease from the lamp was sometimes collected, filtered through moss, and repurposed. Women adapted constantly, inventing solutions others didn't see. They monitored one another. If a girl's energy dropped, she was nudged to eat more. If a grandmother began skipping meals, someone set aside a bit extra and offered it without fuss. The goal was not equality, it was endurance. The group had to last the lean week, and for that, individual appetite came second. Cache raids were dangerous, but sometimes necessary. A woman might walk for hours to check an old snow pit, hoping a frozen seal carcass had not been disturbed by animals or melted by a temperature shift. She carried nothing to defend herself, just rope, a knife, and hope. Social roles flexed under pressure. A woman from another family might share part of her store. A community-wide redistribution could be initiated by elders, but often survival came down to what each woman could do inside her own walls. The fire she kept, the portion she managed, the hope she rationed alongside the meat. Sometimes, starvation lasted weeks. People grew weak, tempers shortened, silence spread. In these times, women turned to habit. They sewed, they cleaned, they kept lamps burning, even if the warmth barely touched their skin. They told stories to children who cried from empty bellies, offered distractions in the form of songs or riddles. The routine didn't stop. If anything, it grew more focused. There were no dramatic statements about hunger, no laments, just work. If a neighbor died, it was women who cleaned the body, arranged the burial, and quietly adjusted the remaining food for those left. If a child grew too weak, women sat beside them through the night, telling old stories with steady voices, even when they themselves hadn't eaten in 2 days. Some kept small caches hidden, even from family. A strip of dried meat behind a sleeping mat, a bundle of aged fat beneath a basket, not out of selfishness but strategy. a last resort meant for the moment when nothing else remained. When that time came, they shared it without flourish. And when spring finally cracked the snow, when seal pups reappeared, when birds returned in distant skylines, the hunger didn't vanish overnight, but the edge of it softened. Women pulled the first bits of fresh meat into the house, boiled it carefully, and portioned it the same way they always had. Children first, men next, themselves last. They didn't tell stories of how hungry they had been. That wasn't the point. The point was that everyone was still there, that the home still stood, that the lamp still burned, and that, once again, they had made it through. They taught survival through repetition, not lectures. In a world where mistakes could be fatal and memory was more valuable than theory, women raised children by embedding knowledge into every routine. Lessons weren't delivered from a chair. They were woven into sewing, feeding, walking, and watching. And the children learned not because they were told, but because they were shown, over and over. There was no formal school, no written curriculum, but every household was a classroom, and every elder a teacher. Girls learned by watching their mothers, how to trim a wick, how to cut a hide, how to seal a food pouch against air. Boys learned by watching the men, but they also learned from the women, especially in the early years, when their time was spent almost entirely indoors, wrapped in fur, carried on backs, sitting at their mother's side. Women began early. A toddler might be handed a dull needle and scrap of hide, not to make anything useful, but to get the feel of the movement. A child might be asked to sort fish by size or fetch clean snow for melting. The tasks were real. The expectations grew with them. Discipline wasn't about punishment. It was about shaping behavior through pattern and consequence. If a child left tools out, those tools might be removed until they noticed their absence. If they disrespected an elder, they were corrected quietly, but immediately. Stories often did the heavy lifting. A tale about a child eaten by a creature in the snow could leave a stronger impression than a scolding. Much of the instruction was non-verbal. A raised eyebrow, a gesture, a pause in work to let silence settle. Women knew when to speak and when to let time deliver the lesson. Children learned to observe carefully, to anticipate needs, to read the subtle cues that governed life in close quarters. They taught environmental awareness, not just how to look at snow, but how to listen to it. Wet snow sounds different beneath boots. Dry snow blows differently across the ice. A child who knew the difference could avoid stepping on a weak spot. A girl might be shown how to identify animal tracks, not for hunting, but to know which direction the prey had come from and what it might mean for the next meal. They taught respect for tools. A child who misused an ulu or damaged a seal scraper was corrected not with anger, but with explanation. That tool took time to make. That blade kept us warm. That crack means more sewing tomorrow. These weren't abstract values, they were survival mechanics. Children were taught to stay still, to sit for hours watching someone sew, to hold their hands steady as they shaped a piece of bone into a hook. Stillness was valued, not as quietness for its own sake, but as a foundation for precision. You couldn't sew a waterproof seam if your hands fidgeted. You couldn't light a fire with trembling fingers. They learned about the body, what warmth looked like, how frostbite began, how to recognize fatigue in a sibling. They learned what food to eat when they felt dizzy, what kind of cold could be fixed with extra furs, and what kind needed someone to intervene. They learned to help without being asked. Boys were taught to respect the work of women from a young age. They watched their clothes get stitched, their boots repaired, their mittens adjusted. No one pretended that hunting was the only form of skill. Boys who didn't understand the domestic work of survival weren't shamed, but they weren't trusted either. A future hunter who didn't know how to patch his gear wouldn't last long. Girls, meanwhile, were prepared early for the expectations they would carry, not in a way that glorified hardship, but in a way that made strength familiar. They were given heavier tasks each year. They learned how to plan a meal from scraps, how to carry a child while sewing, how to negotiate social space when tensions flared. Play had its place, but it was laced with instruction. Children might make tiny sleds or sew miniature boots, replicating adult tasks in manageable scale. Games often mimicked real-life challenges, keeping balance, remembering sequences, staying quiet. Laughter was allowed. So was error, but beneath it all was constant training. Elders played a key role. Grandmothers were often the bearers of old techniques: how to shape a needle from antler, how to prepare fermented foods safely, how to interpret a strange dream. Their tone was often dry, their words few, but their guidance was absorbed fully. A child corrected by a grandmother felt it deeply, not through shame, but through the weight of experience. Even jokes carried weight. A teasing comment about someone's sloppy sewing reminded the group of standards. A story about a boy who bragged too much reinforced the importance of humility. No one said, "This is the lesson," but everyone knew what it was. They didn't ask children what they wanted to be when they grew up. The path was already laid, but within it, each child found their own shape: the one who sewed fastest, the one who spotted weather changes, the one who could make a baby laugh on the worst days. Women didn't teach with flair or speeches. They taught with rhythm, with every thread pulled, every fire lit, every meal stretched, and as the children grew, they carried that rhythm forward, stitched into their hands, built into their eyes, woven through the days until teaching became doing, and doing became life. They traveled between settlements not often, but with purpose, and when they did, women faced the same unforgiving landscape as the hunters, but for different reasons. They weren't tracking game. They were carrying messages, arranging marriages, exchanging goods, or reconnecting family ties stretched thin by distance and time. These journeys were not ceremonial. They were pragmatic, necessary, and quietly dangerous. Most travel happened during the milder seasons. Spring, when the snow was still firm and sleds could glide smoothly, or summer, when open water allowed boat travel. But even in these brief windows of relative ease, the risks were real. The land could shift under your feet, ice cracked without warning, storms rolled in from nowhere, and still, women made the trip. They didn't go alone. Travel was usually done in pairs or small groups: sisters, cousins, co-wives. Companionship offered safety, shared load-bearing, and a second set of eyes to read the sky, the snow, the animals, and it offered conversation. Long stretches of walking or paddling were filled with stories, jokes, planning, and silence, the comfortable kind known only between those who've worked beside each other their whole lives. Journeys were often tied to marriage. A young woman might travel to her husband's settlement, carrying only a few possessions: tools, a few garments, perhaps a pouch of dried food. She left behind family, landscape, familiarity. The transition was permanent in many cases, but she didn't travel like a stranger. Her mother or aunt had likely made a similar trip years before. She was walking a well-worn path, not easy, but no. Other times, women traveled for trade. Items made at home, carefully stitched clothing, bone needles, soapstone bowls, were exchanged for tools, furs, or foods not available in their own region. These exchanges weren't marketplaces with shouting or haggling. They were quiet, measured, built on trust. Women knew the value of their goods and how far they could stretch them. They also brought news: a death, a birth, an illness, a marriage. These weren't letters or scrolls. They were spoken word memorized and repeated with care. A woman who traveled between settlements carried not only her belongings, but the emotional texture of her group. She told stories with precise detail, answered follow-up questions, and remembered to pass along messages from those who couldn't travel themselves. The routes they followed were carved into memory. Not maps. Women knew where to stop for water, which snowfields to avoid, how long it would take to reach the next cluster of homes or tents. They read the ice and the wind like any skilled traveler. They weren't fast, but they were accurate. They didn't boast, but they remembered. Food for the journey was light, efficient, and prepared in advance. Dried meat, frozen fat, pieces of skin that could be chewed for energy. If they traveled by boat, they packed more containers of oil. Dried berries, tools for cutting and stitching in case of damage. If by sled, they layered furs over the runners and carried spare lashings. They planned for loss, for delay, for cold, that bit harder than expected. Sleeping during travel was strategic. In summer, daylight stretched through the night, and rest came when the body demanded it. In winter, they built snow shelters, or found hollows shielded from the wind. Women shared body heat, rotated keeping the lamp lit, and checked each other for signs of frostbite. Their presence meant no one traveled unnoticed. They remembered what was said during rest. They carried it home. Hospitality awaited them. A meal shared, a space cleared, an oil lamp offered. The home wasn't hers, but she adapted quickly, unpacking tools, helping prepare food, sewing beside new faces as if she'd always been there. These visits could last days or weeks, depending on the weather and the purpose. When the time came to return, she packed again, only now, with news, gifts, stories, and maybe new responsibilities. Children sometimes accompanied them, but rarely on long trips. Young girls old enough to learn might be brought along to see, to carry, to begin understanding the world beyond their own hearth. These journeys became quiet rites of passage, a chance to feel the cold differently, to hear unfamiliar voices, to be told, watch that cloud, avoid that ice ridge, remember this direction. Arrival at a new settlement was not casual. Women were watched what they wore, how they moved, how they responded to greetings. A daughter-in-law might be sized up by her future family. A trader's goods might be silently evaluated before any welcome was offered. And yet women navigated these spaces with practiced grace. They smiled when needed, spoke when appropriate, listened more than they talked. Not every journey ended in return. Some women stayed through marriage, through weather, through choice. Others came back changed, quieter or bolder, carrying knowledge that didn't always fit neatly back into their old routines. But all brought value. They were the threads that stitched one camp to the next. They aged into authority, not retirement. In Arctic communities, growing old as a woman did not mean becoming invisible. It meant becoming essential in a new way. As physical labor slowed, mental presence deepened. Older women didn't step aside. They stepped up, stepping into the role of teacher, judge, memory keeper, and quiet leader. Their hands may have stiffened, but their influence sharpened. Their travels weren't mapped. Their names weren't recorded in ledgers. But their footsteps, their observations, their memorized conversations, they held entire networks together across white distances and wordless trails.